Hello and welcome to the Hoop Collective podcast. We talk about the NBA, which we are doing on Thursday in the late morning. I guess it's almost noon in the East. Joining us from the Eastern time zone, but relocated to Indianapolis for this weekend's All-Star Weekend festivities is Tim Bontemps.
Well, since our guy, McMahon, is on vacation, I don't have to teach any vocab today, which I'm very happy about.
Yes, we're stepping it up to the Ivy League of the West Coast because we've got a University of Washington graduate, Kevin the Machine Pelton, joining us from Seattle.
Yeah, I'm sure the UW Alumni Association will be thrilled, or the recruiting department to hear you refer to that as the Ivy League of the West Coast.
I was going to say, what about the Big Ten of the West Coast?
That's right, baby. Ohio State's going out there and stealing Pac-12 coaches.
Look, it snowed here this morning on February 15th, so maybe we are a really Big Ten country now.
I'll tell you what, when I'm in Seattle, that's what I think. This looks like Big Ten country. And yeah, McMahon is taking some much deserved time with the IT department over the weekend. So we've got Pelton very admirably pinch hitting for him here. Speaking of being out west, where Pelton and I am right now, the Western Conference is hitting the All-Star break here. And after about maybe 8-10 days ago, there was basically a four-way tie at first. Things have sorted themselves out, particularly because Minnesota went out west and had a great Western trip, including a win against the Clippers. But the Denver Nuggets lost their third consecutive game on Wednesday night. And for the second time, they lost to the Kings. And for the second game in a row, failed to crack 100 points. Now, Jamal Murray has a shin injury, and he was out for that game. And look, we're not, I think we've seen enough in the NBA not to judge, defending champions too harshly by streaks in the, during the regular season. There was a point earlier this year where they lost 4 out of 5, but they are in 4th place. And Pelton, what I'm more interested in is just their pretty big backslide on the offensive end of the court, and maybe the numbers are pulled down slightly because they, again, failed to crack 100 the last couple of games. But they were the number 1 offensive team in the playoffs last year, and they were a top 10 offensive team during the regular season. They're in the middle of the pack offensively, and plenty of time. I don't doubt them. They've certainly proven themselves, but they're showing a little bit of vulnerability, especially with some teams in the West flexing their muscles.
Yeah, it's pretty wild, especially when you consider that Nikola Jokic is again putting up historic offensive numbers, at the center of this, and Porter and Michael Porter Jr., Jamal Murray have kind of carried their weight. And, we expected a bit of an offensive backslide, I think, from the bench with the loss of Bruce Brown Jr. and knowing that they were going to be so young and unproven there. Peyton Watson has played terrifically, I think, kind of under the radar. Christian Brown has not had the second season that, I'm sure the Nuggets were expecting. And then I think nationally that people were expecting after seeing him play so well in the finals as a rookie. I think what's most interesting to me about Denver as a whole is just kind of the contrast to where they were a year ago, because one of the things I went to go look at is what did the West standings look like a year ago today as compared to what they look like now. And coming out of Valentine's Day a year ago, Denver had opened up 5 games on the rest of the Western Conference. Right. They were en route to basically putting the conference away when they beat Memphis right before the Ja Morant video gun incident in the nightclub in Aurora, Colorado. That night, they basically locked up the Western Conference. And, with a month left in the season, it was very early March. Tim and I were in Boston for the Sloan Conference at that point. And then from that point on, they're able to rest Nikola Jokic considerably the rest of the way, kind of manage their minutes, not have to worry about seeding whatsoever, and still have home court advantage ultimately throughout the playoffs. This year we're looking at a scenario where we'll see just how much, as the defending champions, they worry about seeding, but, home court advantage matters more for Denver because of the altitude than it does anywhere else. And their choice is going to be between not having home court beyond the first round or having, kind of to extend their starters and Jokic in particular down the stretch and not be able to come into the playoffs as rested as they did a year ago.
Oh, and by the way, in the playoffs last year, you mentioned the home court advantage, lost 1 game at home en route to winning the title, right? Obviously, it was a huge advantage for them. You want to look at it on the positive end of the spectrum? I just looked it up while you were talking. Number 1 played lineup this year, Denver starting 5, net rating plus 13 in 654 minutes. Offensive rating, 125. So when their five guys are out there, they still are a dominant team. And there are obviously real questions about the bench. You mentioned Christian Brown. I saw them a few times a couple weeks ago. It was interesting how Peyton Watson has sort of surpassed him in the depth chart there, and he hasn't really had the same kind of year he did last year. Reggie Jackson experience has not been great. Obviously, their bench gets better in the playoffs when they have Aaron Gordon play those center minutes like they did in the game in Boston, which was a game they clearly ratcheted up and wanted to win, and went out and had Aaron Gordon play basically the entire second half. I think he did play the entire second half of that game and played backup center in that game, and they closed out a game on the road against Boston. So we've seen them dial it up, and I think when we talked about them at the time, I said they remind me of some of those LeBron teams with Miami and Cleveland where they sort of feel like they're in cruise control and they're just going to turn it up when it matters in a couple of months. But again, if you have the number one seed and you're getting a team coming out of a play-in tournament, it's a little bit different thing than if you're, say, playing Phoenix in the first round and then going on the road to play the number one seed in the second round. Like, it's got the potential to be a more difficult road at minimum than it was last year.
Yeah, you bring up a good point about their bench, because their bench is super duper young, because you're really relying on a bunch of, not relying, but you got a bunch of first and second year players. I guess Peyton Watson's a second year player. There's a lot of guys playing those roles that you need. And, you just feel the loss of Bruce Brown and Jeff Green there. And now look, at the highest level, when it really matters, Jokic is going to be out there 40 plus minutes. Gordon's going to be out there 40 plus minutes. Murray's going to be playing heavy minutes. It might not matter, but I do think there's something to be said. It's something to point out that they haven't shown the same resiliency during the regular season as they did last year. One of the things I think will define the Western Conference playoffs, leaving potential runs by the Warriors and Lakers out for now, because that's contractually obligated to talk about on TV on ESPN. Looking at these top four players, these top four teams, youth and experience is a big thing. Looking at this top four, in my view, you've got the Thunder, who are arguably want to be one of the youngest teams we've ever seen in a high playoff seed.
Not arguably, they will be. I mean, we'll see how
right.
Gordon Hayward changes their age a little bit, but it's them and the first incarnation of the Thunder.
Right. And then you look at the Timberwolves. Now, the Timberwolves have some experienced players. Obviously, Mike Conley, obviously Rudy Gobert, plenty of playoff games there. But as a collective, this is an organization that hasn't had any playoff success. They haven't won a playoff series. I looked this up the other day, since Ant was 2, which is just an indication of and so Karl Towns is not a young player. But again, if you're asking a team to win 3 playoff series that's never won one playing together,
experience. Their 2 All-Stars have a combined 3 playoff victories, not playoff series victories, playoff game victories.
Exactly. So, that's a big ask. And then you look at Denver, and their bench is a little young. Obviously they got a bunch of guys with rings, and then you look at the Clippers, and they have everything. They have depth, they have experience, they have guys with rings. They got, like, PJ Tucker got sent home this week. PJ Tucker would be getting how many minutes a game in Denver? Like, Denver would be running him out there in their top 7, I think, without question. I mean, if he didn't play well, fine, but if PJ Tucker was available as a buyout candidate and Denver signed him, he'd be in that rotation lickety split. And he hasn't played since November for the Clippers. Okay,
it's a Clippers cast off, and Reggie Jackson is currently in the Denver rotation.
And by the way, you mentioned that Clipper team last night or Wednesday night for pod listeners. They're playing in Golden State. They're down most of the game, and in the fourth quarter, they come back and win that game with Kawhi Leonard not playing and with Paul George fouling out with 4 minutes to go. And that run was largely driven by Norm Powell and other bench guys who were playing great. And like their depth, obviously, like you said, when you get to the playoffs, depth matters less because your star players play a lot more. But the Clippers don't have any weak links when it comes to really their rotation stuff. Like, they're rolling out there with some pretty potent lineups up and down that can do a lot of different things. And I thought that was a really impressive game from them.
Yeah, since you brought that up,
Wednesday.
since you brought that game up, a very high character win. Now, just again, the Clippers lost at home earlier this week to the Timberwolves, where the Wolves demonstrated how their size really can make a difference. The Clippers do have some issues with size at times, or have it's been an issue. It's been a little bit of a thorn for them. This is the last game before the All-Star break. It's a total getaway game situation. Kawhi doesn't play. He did make the trip with them, which I respected, by the way. He came up and was on the bench. Totally would have been understood if he wanted an extra day. And, he was dealing with an injury and just stay at home. But I respect that he came with them. And they're down 15 or 17 or something like that. Golden State's won 5 games in a row. It's on the road. Ty Lue gets ejected with like 9 minutes to go, which doesn't usually happen. Ty will get a tech every now and then, but he usually keeps his cool. He gets ejected. And they handle their business and get a really good Golden State started double teaming, and they just really just ran their offense, moved the ball. You mentioned Norm Powell, Bontemps. Powell hit, I think, 4 threes in the fourth quarter. And just a real high character win. And by the way, also, I'll say the same thing about the Lakers on Wednesday going into Salt Lake, which historically taking teams coming on a back-to-back off the West Coast, Salt Lake has feasted on those situations for decades. And LeBron doesn't make the trip, and they're catching on back-to-back, total getaway game situation where, you could just totally let go on that, and the Lakers go in there and win. And I'll just, interestingly, you'll know the result when this pod comes out. But the Warriors now are going into Salt Lake tonight, Thursday night, in a makeup game for one of the games that was postponed when their assistant coach, Decky, passed away suddenly a couple of weeks ago. It's a tough, again, coming off the West Coast, coming off a tough loss. Let's see how the Warriors handle this test. Now, granted, I don't know how the Jazz are not in the greatest headspace right now because of they didn't upgrade. They sort of downgraded their roster while in a playoff position at the trade deadline. But we'll see how that same test is. But anyway, going all the way back to the Nuggets, Pelton. What's your concern level about them in general? Are we just filling time in February here, talking about a little losing streak?
Like I said, I think that element of the way that they were able to set up for last year's playoffs is what separates it to me, because I referenced it was a little bit less than a year ago that Tim and I were at Sloan and the Nuggets had all but locked up the first seed. And one of the things that talking to people from the Nuggets mentioned was, the previous 2 years, their playoff runs, that Jokic was exhausted by that point in the season from having to carry them without a healthy Jamal Murray throughout the regular season. And, with the concern about seeding, it's not going to be to that degree. And Jamal Murray, even though he's dealing with something right now, there's every reason to expect that he's going to be healthy, will be around. So that is a moderate concern. And then the other interesting thing is, they're not eligible for buyout candidates who are making above the mid-level because of the fact that they're in the luxury tax, like so many of these teams. It doesn't seem like they're all that interested anyway. One of the bets that Kelvin Booth and this Denver front office has made is, we're not going to give Michael Malone the option of playing veterans over some of these young guys by going out and getting kind of the high quality minimum players that some of these other teams in the West have, or some of these other contending teams. And, that they're going to kind of sink or swim with these young guys. And that, I think that, as Tim mentioned, that Boston game is a really instructive, in terms of how they're going to approach the playoffs. Gordon played the entire second half, as Tim said. And Michael Malone only played 7 guys total. Christian Brown was a DNP in the second half. It was only Peyton Watson and Reggie Jackson off the bench, and that was it. So how many guys are they going to trust in the playoffs? Those are the 2 levels of concern for me. So I'm probably at like a 4 or a 5.
Okay. Yeah. They have another game with Boston coming up shortly after the All-Star break. The Celtics go on a West Coast trip. And I actually want to talk about the Celtics, but before we do, speaking of interesting moves before going on the All-Star break, I think we got to talk real quickly about the game that happened last night in Phoenix. I should say Wednesday night in Phoenix, where before the game even started, Isaiah Stewart sucker punched Drew Eubanks from the Suns in the back, in like the tunnel in the back. I don't have a lot of details, and I'm sort of expecting by the end of the day video to pop up on TMZ. And I don't know the potential history between Beef Stew and Drew Eubanks, unless you guys know and you can step in here. What I will just say is that it's very unusual for there to be a backstage confrontation in Phoenix, and the reason is because Phoenix is an old school arena, and there's only 2 tunnels to get off of the floor, and the teams walk literally at complete opposite ends to their locker rooms, and it's a very long walk in between them. And not only that, it's such a long walk that last year, you may remember during the playoffs, Russell Westbrook was cutting through the courtside club, where he got into a screaming match with a fan because he was just trying to take a shortcut at halftime. So it makes me, without having all the details, it makes me wonder that he really hunted him down, because he would have had to have gone the complete opposite direction to get anywhere near the Suns locker room. I don't know. Maybe Eubanks was in the other tunnel. I don't know.
Well, it said, he said that Eubanks said it happened as he was coming into the arena. So,
wow.
Obviously I wasn't there.
An ambush?
I don't know if it was an ambush. I don't think we should start throwing around random words about this.
I agree.
From the news story, the AP story on our site, it says Eubanks said before the game that the altercation happened as he was coming into the arena. He said an argument started and they were chest to chest before Stewart threw the punch. Security intervened and Eubanks said he was fine for the game. The police said he suffered a minor injury. So,
all right. We haven't seen a fight in the loading dock since Jerry Stackhouse and Kirk Snyder. Google it.
At least we haven't heard about a fight in the loading dock. I wouldn't check down.
Yeah.
They are both Pac-12 guys, at least for the rest of this year. But Eubanks was already a pro by the time that Isaiah Stewart was at Washington, so it doesn't date back that far.
Yeah, look at it. The fact is too. Isaiah Stewart's got a few various incidents like this now at various points. Everybody remembers obviously him trying to get after LeBron on the court, but he's had a couple of these things over his career. It'll be interesting to see how this plays out. Yeah. Certainly a strange story.
And then he was arrested after the game by the Phoenix police and released. So somebody has seen footage. There's witnesses that also Eubanks said it was no big deal. It was a soft punch, which I don't know about that. I would not mess with Isaiah Stewart. And then, by the way, Devin Booker gets thrown out of that game 5 minutes in. 2 different technicals 5 minutes into that game.
Seemed like a pretty soft ejection to me.
Oh my God, it was crazy. I couldn't hear obviously what Booker was saying, but so that's the other end of the spectrum of the character wins that we saw. Just to sort of underline, not just giving lip service to that. And then the Pistons, not surprisingly, got blown out by the Suns in that game. But anyway, a few minutes ago we were talking about Boston. Bontemps got a fair amount of reaction to the straw poll from a couple of days ago, and one of the surprises I think was that Jason Tatum remained 6th. I would say that the voters were unmoved by Tatum's play recently, because he was 6th in your first poll in December, 6th in this poll, no first or second place votes. Despite him having a good season and the Celtics just having a spectacular first half, more than first half, first 50 games. They won by 50 on Wednesday night against the Nets. He had 40 in that game to go, or he had 40 on Tuesday. They played them back home and home. Tatum is shooting the ball better this year. His scoring average is down, but that's not a bad thing. He's taking sort of some smarter shots. What's your opinion as to why Tatum hasn't gotten more traction in MVP voting?
I mean, we talked about this a little bit the other day. I think it's a combination of. I mean, I think it's less about the way that he and the Celtics have played in the playoffs, and I just think it's more that, because we talked about that the other day. I think it's more that his numbers are very good, but they're just not of the same supercharged caliber of these other guys that we're talking about. In part because the Celtics have a ton of talent, and they've got Kristaps Porzingis getting the ball a bunch, and Jaylen Brown getting the ball a bunch, and Derek White and Drew Holiday getting the ball a bunch. So his usage rate is lower than some of these other guys. And I also think part of it is he's just not quite seen in the same realm as Giannis and Luka and Jokic, and even to an extent, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander as a player. Now, again, I think he's one of the 10 best players clearly in the league. He's probably, for me, somewhere between like 6 or 7 and 9. Like, tremendous player, but generally you see a guy who's in the top 5 win this award. And I think if Boston goes on to win 65 games, which they're very capable of doing, then perhaps that will change as the year goes along. But I think with the numbers that these other guys are putting up, I just think it's going to be difficult for Tatum to move up higher on the ballot. And I sort of think this is what we're going to see for a while for Jason Tatum, frankly, which is that he's probably going to be somewhere around 4th or 5th every year, which is basically what he's been, because he's an awesome player and his team is awesome, but he's just not quite seen as a top 5 guy in the league as of now. Now he's also like 26 and has continued to get better, and he could ascend more. But I think that's generally why he's, I don't want to say an afterthought, but he's farther down the list than these other guys.
Yeah, Zach Lowe and I both picked Tatum before the season when we did an awards pod, under kind of the logic that, number one, the Celtics we thought were the best team in the NBA, and number two, that some of the players that traditionally have been at the top of the ballot might be ineligible because of the 65 game rule, as we have now seen to come to pass with Joel Embiid. I think part of it is not only that Tatum's numbers are not as good as the top 3 guys in particular. They're also not even as good as last season because of, the additions the Celtics have made. And it's kind of funny. I can understand if you're a Celtics fan, it seems like from a individual recognition standpoint, people are talking out of both sides of their mouth where, on the one hand, Tatum is on the same level. On the other hand, we have this team that's clearly far and away the best regular season team in the league, plus 10-point differential, going to have a terrific, regular season, like one that stacks with the all-time best regular seasons. And they have 2 all-stars, which is kind of funny. I mean, Derek White and Kristaps Porzingis, kind of 2 in that next group out in the Eastern Conference. But to go back to Tatum specifically, I did not ultimately have him on my ballot. I think, the top 3 to me, assuming those guys stay healthy, are pretty close to a lock. Those guys, have separated themselves from the field, being Jokic, Giannis, and SGA. 4th and below, that's up for debate. I think very much so. And Tatum has a chance if he has a strong finishing kick down the stretch here, and Boston, remains number 1 by a wide margin. I think 4th is probably his ceiling, which is where he finished last year.
Right, that's true. Now, I will say that the Celtics have a number of high-profile national television games after the break here, including that game in Denver. There is a window for him to sort of improve his case, although the way they play, the depth that they have, the way that they spread the ball around, I mean, he could play brilliantly and still not get, that sort of string of 40 or 50 or even the 60-point games that some of the other guys at the top have gotten. And he has said that's not what he's looking for. So I'm a big believer in Tatum. I have sort of locked horns with the other guys on this pod in the past over my belief that he can be a top 5 player and do it at the highest level. He has taken he has taken some hits in the last couple of years for the way he played in the finals. He just did not have a great finals. He was being bothered by a wrist injury, but I think he had a 13 or 14 point performance in the elimination game against the Warriors on their home floor. Last year, he had a very anemic performance on Game 7 against the Heat on his home floor. He was awesome in Game 7 against the Sixers. He had 51, and that game was a blowout. He didn't seem like he got the maybe appropriate credit for that, and he also was great in the fourth quarter of Game 6. So it's not like the resume is all full of holes. He just, and even Donovan Mitchell, who, Donovan responded, to the straw poll, not directly, but, I think Donovan was a little bit frustrated that he wasn't higher on the straw poll and talked about it a little bit the next couple of, like 36 hours after it came out, even though the Cavs had a kind of a shaky loss at home to the 76ers that, were missing like 3 top guys. Donovan was talking after the game about his MVP chances, but he did come on NBA Today on Wednesday and was talking about how he thinks that his MVP candidacy is affected by his scattered playoff record, and that he understands that for him to really ever get up there, he probably has to prove himself in the postseason, fair or not. So I think that is a factor.
It also just needs to be said that the ballot is full of ridiculous players. Like Kevin Durant is averaging 28 points on 54% shooting, 44% from 3, averaging like 6 rebounds, just under 6 assists. And he got like a handful of votes. I think he was 9th, right? Like, we're talking about like, there's a lot of guys having unbelievable seasons. So I don't think and I'm not saying you're framing it this way, but I don't think it's a crime that Jason Tatum is 6th and Donovan Mitchell is 8th.
I agree.
It's a loaded field. It's very hard to pick between these guys.
I agree. And, and just we're in this such offensive era that, because if you're a Cavs fan and you're not watching the league and you're watching Donovan put up these 45-point games and, routinely put up 30, and your team's in second place in the East and you've won 16 out of 18 or 17 out of 19 or whatever it is now. And, this straw poll is, it's really, really authentic. It's one of the, McMahon makes fun of me, but like truly it's a really good thing that Bontemps has done. And it like is a real good data readout on the way things are. And like, so if you're a Cavs fan, or if you're a Celtics fan, you're watching Tatum have all these really good games, and then you see this poll, I get where you're like, what's going on? But it's hard to have that perspective. I mean, just for offensive perspective, the Lakers, okay, they put up 138 at the Jazz on Wednesday night. And Stats Williams had this incredible number that over the last 11 games, the Lakers have had the highest point average for an 11-game stretch since 1987. And you would never look at this Laker team and say, boy, that's going to rival the Showtime Lakers. But they are playing Showtime level basketball offensively right now. So I think there is some sort of grappling with the numbers, and that lack of perspective can affect the way people look at the MVP race, because even though we've seen this scoring bubble over the last few years, it's still, accelerating at this point. But anyway, I want to talk a little more about the Celtics. Bontemps. So they are hitting the All-Star break. They're 43-12. I think they've got a 6-game lead over the Cavs. The Cavs are 18-3 since January 1st, and they've barely picked up any ground on the Celtics. They are kind of like in the zone where the Nuggets were last year. They're like in great shape to get that number 1 seed, all number 1 overall seed too. And when you look at their production, they okay, in the history of the Celtics, we're going back to 1947. They've had 5 50-point wins in franchise history. 2 of them have happened this year. Okay. Their net efficiency, which is what they were relative to the score for every 100 possessions, they're plus 10.3. That you get, Pelton, you get double digit net ratings, net efficiency. You're talking about some of the best teams of all time. The last time a team had a plus 10 or better net efficiency was the 16-17 Warriors, which was the first year that Durant came there, which I will put up as arguably the best team in NBA history, because they added a prime MVP to a 73-win team, basically in exchange for Harrison Barnes and Andrew Bogut. That is the level that this team is playing at right now. But I wonder, do teams, after the way the Celtics have played in the playoffs the last 2 years, Bontemps, do you think that this Celtics team is inspiring any fear, considering the way that they are playing and the numbers are putting up?
I mean, fear is sort of an interesting way to frame it, right? Like, I think that the Celtics are in the same position Denver was in last year, where Denver was the best team in the West all year, right? And everybody was sort of, and like, look, I'll be the first to say, I kept saying, we've never seen a team with a center like Jokic in terms of his ability to be impactful defensively or not impactful defensively, be a team that wins a title. It just was not something we'd seen. And so you kind of had to see it to believe it, right? And then Denver goes out, they destroy everybody in the playoffs, and you look back on it, well, we should have sort of expected this was how this was going to go, at least possibly, because of the way they played during the year. And I think Boston's in a similar place because of the way the last several years have gone, the way they've had failures in the playoffs several times over in very similar fashion, where their offense has gotten bogged down. And frankly, they've just struggled to get out of a lot of series against teams that don't have as much talent as them. I think there's a lot of hesitancy to look at the way they're playing and go, hey, this is going to translate to a dominant playoff run. But the introduction to Kristaps Porzingis, when the Celtics made that move, the main reason they did it was they needed to have a different option late in games and playoffs. And they had to have a way to attack mismatches in playoffs because Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown have not been super successful attacking isolations in those situations in the playoffs. And the introduction of Porzingis and his ability to space the floor and attack mismatches and force a guy like Bam Adebayo, like we've talked about before, to have to stay with him, not be able to roam around and just do what he wants on defense, it's really completely altered the way the Celtics attack these late game situations. And doesn't guarantee they're going to win, but they just are a supremely talented team. And I don't think the doubters are going to necessarily go away until we see them do it in the playoffs. But the way they are playing and the way they are preparing for the playoffs and trying different things during the season and experimenting all over the place, I think it sets them up to be a different team than they've been in the postseason in the past. And I think they have the potential to, when we get to the end of June, have won the title, and for us to be sitting back saying, we really should have just assumed this team was different than they've been. And they did put up a historic resume, and we should have assumed they had a chance to be a historic team. Not guaranteeing it's going to happen, but that framework is there where it is, I think, a lot like Denver last year, where I think until people see it, there's just going to be that hesitancy to say, this is the year they're finally going to break through because of the stuff we've seen in the past.
When Denver went 10-1 to finish the playoffs last year, I was like, oh, they're pretty damn good. Now, they did benefit from a little bit of a wonky way the playoffs went, and they got the Lakers who, were playing, they got two play-in teams, in the conference finals and finals. Now, they had earned their way to those spots. I'm just saying, though, that, but nonetheless, Denver at the end was totally flexing on everybody, just slapping everybody down. And it was like, oh, well, this is the way it was. So I appreciate what you're saying there, Bontemps. But I do think, Pelton, because the Celtics have not played to their top level at the playoffs last couple of years, and I'm saying that about a team that's gone to the finals and conference finals, but, was ahead in the finals and lost it, and, lost a game 7 at home after completely just coming out flat in the front end of that conference finals. I do think that there's a bit of some scar tissue with the Celtics as well.
Yeah, there's only so much that they can prove during the regular season. Now, I do think, to your point at the start of this, we should recognize that this year's Celtics are way beyond what they did the last couple of years, what they've done over this run. As long as they go better than, let me double check my math here, 15-12 the rest of the regular season, it will be the most wins for the Celtics since 2009, since that second big three team that KG was injured in the playoffs and they lost to Orlando that year in a really hard fought 7-game series in the second round. Right now, the Celtics team has the sixth best winning percentage or the fifth best winning percentage in franchise history, which, as you alluded to at the top, there's a lot of history in Boston.
It's a lot of banners.
There are.
What is the Celtics record for regular season wins?
68.
Yeah, I was going to say.
I don't. That's not falling this year.
No. I think, especially because it'll be interesting to see how they handle the end of the regular season. As we talked about that comparison to Denver and the way that they really kind of coasted to the finish line with Jokic in particular, that hasn't been the Celtics' MO. Under a variety of different coaches and continuing now through Joe Mazzulla. They're not a team that, has relied on load management other than with Al Horford and now this season, maybe Kristaps Porzingis. How much will they rest Tatum and Brown and the other starters down the stretch will be interesting. Clearly they're going to manage the centers minutes with Xavier Tillman Sr. Jackson pointed out in the comments the clutch win percentage difference for the Celtics, which is what had been kind of their Achilles heel in the playoffs going back. And I think it's interesting because, the element there, Kristaps Porzingis, I think is the biggest addition. But in terms of like respect from other opponents, Tim kind of yada over the best part, which is they also added Drew Holiday, who is who is a proven finals, player, someone who has defended the opponent's best player up through that point and earned a lot of respect doing it. And he's had kind of a down regular season, isn't one of the 4 Celtics who figured into the All-Star discussion this year, but come playoff time, he hasn't played well necessarily offensively in the playoffs in a lot of these runs, but his defense is another factor that I think could separate this group even from the ones that had the defensive player of the year in Marcus Smart on the perimeter the last couple of years.
I mean, look, they went from Grant Williams and Marcus Smart essentially to Kristaps Porzingis and Drew Holiday, right? Like that's a massive talent upgrade. And yeah, Al Horford's taking a little bit of a step back, but still, that was why from the beginning I was sort of laughing at people when people were talking about the Porzingis trade. Like, this guy is a really talented player, and then you fast forward to get Drew Holiday, and you could debate about stuff they gave up. I mean, we talked about it the other day. The Mavs have given up, essentially 3 first-round picks to get PJ Washington and Daniel Gafford on their team. And the Celtics, I think, were down maybe 1 first-round pick and got those 2 guys. Now, good players left to help facilitate that, but still, that's a huge talent infusion for a team that already might have had more talent than any other team in the league.
Well, I think one thing that you can say without any question is they sold extremely high on Marcus Smart. And I know that was a tough move to make for a number of different reasons. And there was a lot of criticism about him, about them trading away this, kind of a soul of the team. Obviously, he didn't always get along with everybody, but to get Porzingis and 2 firsts in return for Marcus Smart. And then, look, people weren't 100% sold on Porzingis. I mean, they were big believers in him, but, there was some skepticism about him putting up kind of, a little bit of inflated numbers in Washington.
Well,
and then
let's just be honest. After the Dallas thing, when as we've talked about, McMahon has talked about openly, he got basically salary dumped to Washington.
That's right.
He was a guy that had a lot of questions about him. And it's not what the biggest thing I heard all summer was people around the league saying, is this Porzingis thing really going to work? And is he going to be cool being the 3rd or 4th guy on the team, or how is that going to go? And as I've said before, from the moment he showed up in Boston, he's had an ear-to-ear smile, and he has been clearly thrilled to be out of essentially NBA purgatory with the Wizards, where nobody was paying attention to him, and being on one of the iconic franchises in the league, on arguably the best team in the league. And he's a guy who, going back to when he was with the Knicks, has always liked the spotlight and being, in a big market and playing on a big stage. And he has been exemplary on and off the court for Boston.
Yeah. And look, he's got to stay healthy for it to ultimately work. That was one of the reasons why it hadn't worked before. But not only did they trade for him, but and then immediately gave him a $60 million extension. So they ran. I will say this too. Brad Stevens has acquitted himself extremely well as an executive since he's risen to that. Remember that deal. They had a deal for Malcolm Brogdon, which would have gotten them Porzingis, and it ultimately sent Brogdon to the Clippers. And it fell apart the day before the draft or draft day. I can't remember. I think it was the day before the draft.
And they had this draft, yeah.
And they had this deadline with Porzingis to pick up his option. And Porzingis and his representation made it clear they weren't extending the deadline. And so they kind of were racing against the clock. And so not only did they have to make a trade, but they had to make a trade under duress. And so shout out to the Celtics front office, which is, Brad Stevens, Mike Zarin, Austin Ainge, Dave Lewin. That front office scrambling and then putting together that deal that, again, Porzingis got to stay healthy, but right now looks like a freaking home run under duress, with the whole league knowing that, one of the reasons with Brogdon was there was some concern over his elbow. Ended up being okay, and they ended up doing a trade with him, obviously, and for Drew Holiday, ended up working out great for them. But they really weren't able to find a deal for Brogdon. So it was like, okay, figure out this trade that's super important. The only way you're going to be able to get Porzingis, and you lost, you were diminished in the ability to trade Brogdon, and with like the clock bearing down on you. So history forgets that, but like that was, and then, like I said, it was a risk, but it really looks like it's bearing fruit for them right now.
I mean, I think the fascinating thing about it is the reason it was a risk is because they were giving up smart and dramatically changing the style of play that had been very successful to them up to a point. And that's why, it would have been really fascinating to see the version of the Celtics that they envisioned all off season. But then the Damian Lillard trade happens and the Celtics are kind of just dropped in their laps thanks to these extra first round picks they had from the Marcus Smart trade, with the ability to go out and get Drew Holiday. And suddenly it's not that we've changed our style of play. We've given up what we did so well to get Kristaps Porzingis and try to do something a little different. It's that we can still do all the same things because Drew Holiday is an improved version of Marcus Smart in many senses. And we've got this new dimension. It is also kind of fascinating. I mean, you mentioned them selling high on Smart. Was there any discussion from the Grizzlies trading Smart at the deadline? Because that's something that with their financial crunch next year and with the emergence of Vince Williams Jr. as an option on the wing, was an interesting possibility to me.
I didn't hear anything about it. Smart's unfortunately been impacted by injuries a lot of this year, and now is out with a finger injury. So I'm not sure what his return timetable is, but.
Well, and the one other thing, we have talked about this a little bit before. The other thing about the Smart trade that was beneficial for Boston is it sort of forced both Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown into more of a leadership role with this team. So Marcus Smart has always been there. He's always been the heart and soul of the team and sort of the emotional center of the team in a lot of ways. And I wrote a story back in November about Jason Tatum getting the six guys together and sort of organize a meeting to talk about how this is going to go and who wasn't going to figuring out, let's not get caught up in who's starting or finishing games or not worried about any of that kind of stuff. And I'm not sure he would have done that a year earlier because Marcus would have been there and Marcus probably would have been saying something. Right. And I do think that for guys who are entering their prime, I think it was a notable thing that it did sort of seed the stage for them to step up in that regard. And I think Tatum has noticeably been a little different about that this year. And I think that's helped them in a lot of respects. And I think the way they cleared the air on this stuff from the jump, there's been not one bit of any kind of drama with this team at all. And look, obviously it's easy for that to be the case in some respects when you're 43-12 or whatever their record is right now. But I think they deserve a lot of credit for getting out ahead of that. And that was also in part due to the trade and due to those guys having to take on a bigger leadership role and kind of assume that mantle that they wouldn't have had to otherwise.
By the way, on Wednesday night, as they blasted the Nets, this is a Nets aided stat that I'm about to say. They surpassed the Pacers as the number one offensive team in the league, also ranking third in defense. You got top three in both. That's pretty damn impressive. That's how you get a plus 10 net rating, but they're now the best offense in the league as well. Before we go, I do want to just shout out real quick the way the New Orleans Pelicans are playing. They're sort of stuck in between where a lot of the focus has been, because those front four teams in the West have really been fascinating, each of them in their own right. And then naturally, there's a whole lot of attention on the Warriors and Lakers, in the play-in spot, and even the Mavericks, who've been playing better lately, and their trades at the deadline. Quietly, the Pelicans, who really did, from what I understand, try to upgrade at the deadline, but they really couldn't. They weren't able to find a deal. They won 7 of their last 8 games. Now, the game that they won going into the break, they beat the Wizards in a shootout. It wasn't the most impressive victory. Deni Avdija had 45 points in that game for the Wizards. But the Pelicans are 7-1 in their last 8 games. They were just out here on the West Coast. Last week they were here. And Zion had 36 points in that game. Now, the Wizards have just traded their franchise center in Daniel Gafford. So it was not Bill Russell defending the rim, or more appropriately, Wes Unseld defending in the rim there for the Wizards. But Zion had 15 baskets in the paint in that game. And, one of the things that they have gone really back to recently, Willie Green, the coach, has gone back to really playing Zion at point guard. That's something that, Stan Van Gundy sort of adopted a couple of years ago. Then they went away from it, and now they're gone back to it. And they have been very effective offense. They've been a very good defensive team consistently since Willie Green got there. Their offense has ebbed and flowed because they haven't had good shooting. Zion doesn't stretch the floor. Valanciunas doesn't stretch the floor. They get a little compacted. They've also, Herb Jones, who's gotten better as a three-point shooter, but he doesn't stretch the floor. So they haven't always had most terrific high efficiency offense. But in this stretch where Zion has been running point, they are seeing a lot of success. Pelton, the number is crazy that Stats Williams sent out today. In the last 9 games, when Zion initiates the possession running point guard, they're averaging 1.4 points per possession. 1 point per possession. 1 point per possession in anything, whether it's a post up or anything, is considered good. 1.4 for a team that needs offense is considered very, very good. It's hard
context, for me. And for context, in case people aren't sure, when we're talking about like the Celtics having like the Denver lineup having 125 offensive rating, that means it's 1.25 points per possession, right? So it's essentially 140 points per 100 possessions. What we're talking about, like that's obviously pretty insane stuff over that kind of a span.
Yeah. So I don't. It's hard. It's been hard to project the Pelicans for the last couple of years, Pelton, because there's been so many injuries. I really think they were on an upward trajectory after 2 seasons ago, but it really hasn't paid off. Brandon Ingram was really banged up last year for a lot of the year with foot problems. They are a team that they have some big decisions to make in the offseason because they've got to pay some of these guys. I don't know if they're going to be able to keep this team together, but they are a dangerous team. They are a flawed team, but they can be a dangerous team.
I mean, that's why it was kind of fascinating what you mentioned about them potentially looking to upgrade at the trade deadline instead of, make some adjustments to manage the salary down the road, which, like, they're playing too well to do that. But, you alluded to the injuries later. When you said that their offense has been up and down, I thought you were going to say because of the fact that they haven't had their 3 guys together until this stretch over the last couple of months. And then the other guy who's been a huge part of it is Trey Murphy III, who was part of our draft show last year. Yeah.
Friend of our pod.
Since he came back in the lineup, they are 19-11, playing at almost a 2/3 clip because he provides that floor spacing and he gives them, he's just an incredibly valuable player to have largely coming off the bench. It's an incredible luxury for Willie Green. So yeah, there's so many teams in the West who have been on runs and have this star pedigree and these expectations. If you look at it, 7 out of the 10 teams that would make the West playoffs or play in if the season ended today have gone 7-3 in their last 10 games precisely.
Oh,
5 of them are the teams between 5th and 10th. Every team in that group, other than Sacramento, has gone 7-3 in their last 10 games. So you mentioned the strong run for Dallas. Obviously Phoenix in 5th is a team that
the Lakers have won 8 out of 11.
Golden State is also 7 of their last 10. So there's a reason we're talking about these teams besides just the fact that they're the Warriors and the Lakers, but they haven't made up any ground on the New Orleans Pelicans, who are still holding strong to that 6th and final spot in the playoffs, avoiding the play-in. And that's going to be such a huge cut line in the Western Conference because they're going to be 2 really good teams that are going to get knocked out in the play-in.
Yeah. And, on the flip side of it, I still have doubts about the Pelicans because I just don't know if their overall pieces really fit together great, right? Like in 32 games, should say, that CJ McCollum, Brandon Ingram, and Zion Williamson have played together. 20-12 record, like that is good. But across 558 minutes, they're minus 2.6 net rating, right? And their offense has just not been good. And with Jonas Valanciunas out there, they have struggled. Their 5-man starting lineup is underwater for the season. A couple of points negative also. It's the 11th most used lineup in the league. And like you mentioned, Trey Murphy, it's going to be interesting to see what happens moving forward in New Orleans because you look at a guy like Trey Murphy and the way he fits with their guys and all of the lineups of Trey Murphy, every combination is very positive. And at some point, you might need to find a way to get him out there on a more consistent basis. And see what that looks like. And it's just going to be interesting to see what that looks like. But we are finally, hopefully, going to get an opportunity to see this New Orleans team at full strength in the playoffs, which is what we've been waiting for now for feels like a decade.
Knock on wood. Knock on wood on that.
Right,
yeah.
Knock on wood. And I hope we do, because then we'll really get some answers to what some of this stuff looks like in a playoff setting. And then I think the Pelicans, who have a ton of draft assets and they've got a ton of interesting players on their roster, can then maybe start to look at this and say, all right, this is the direction we need to go in to try to get this thing to the next level. Because I think a lot of what they've done is have to wait and see what they actually have, because so much of the time it's been, well, if these guys are healthy or if they're out there, or are we going to see them out there? And now we're actually getting a chance to see that. And they're probably, to me, one of the most interesting teams over the final 30 games and in the playoffs, just to see what it actually looks like. Because, I mean, we still haven't seen, I'm correct that we still haven't seen Zion play a single playoff game, right?
No.
Right. So, like
play-in, right? They made the play.
I think he's been
I don't think
the times that they've been in the play-in.
Yeah, I don't think he played in a play-in game either. I don't think he's played in a single postseason game of any kind. So, like,
yeah, that's right. That's why we were so disappointed by their showing in Vegas, because that was like the biggest game of his career, and he just laid down.
Yeah. So, like, it's just going to be fascinating to see what they look like, because we just haven't seen this full group go up against these elite teams at a high stage like that, and it's going to, I think, be very clarifying for what their immediate future looks like.
Yeah. All right. Well, a lot of things to look forward to. Are you looking forward to All-Star Weekend? I think Steph Curry, Sabrina Ionescu is the highlight on the menu for me. Bontemps. I'm not sure if I'm
looking on the LED court at Lucas Oil Stadium, where the NBA is going to be all about being back to basketball, playing in a football stadium. It's going to be good
on an LED court.
Yeah.
Well, we'll see. They are trying to. And in addition to going back to East versus West rosters on Sunday, they are not going to, according to Adam Silver, not going to have a big, long, giant introduction ceremony and all this different stuff, so the players can properly warm up and go through their routine. Jackson is furious that you can't shoot on the hoop at the airport. They installed a faux court at the airport in Indianapolis, and you can't.
Look, the NBA spent a lot of time this year talking about how they need to have people care about the All-Star game as far as the players go, and the product needs to be better than last year. I am curious to see how it goes. We'll just put it that way.
Now, some of these tweaks they've made for the first year make a big difference. You know, the first time that we had the draft, I think, was the All-Star game in LA that was terrific. The first year that we went to the Elam Ending gave us the
It was good.
great game in Chicago that we had. It's the year 2 and beyond that tends to be the issue. But, the warm up is, I think it is more than a joke that's a factor that throws players out of their routines. I think probably the bigger issue is the number of parties that are held on Saturday night. The NBA probably not going to be able to change that one's out of Pandora's box.
I suspect that will not be changing.
Well, Mr. Bontemps will be all over the social coverage for us. We can't wait for your updates. All right. Thank you, Mr. Pelton. Thank you, Mr. Bontemps. Enjoy Indianapolis. Thank you to Jackson, our producer. Thank you for listening. We'll talk to you next week.